All right, so it's been a few days since I talked to you guys last, but I had a very interesting and amazing observation just about myself in the last couple days. As you know, just to recap, I sent my dad a confession letter. He wrote back, and it was a very defensive response. Basically, it's made it seem like he didn't hear anything that I said. And so I responded to that, and I basically called him out on it, just saying like, "Hey, I think you completely missed the point of what I was trying to do here." And it forced him to go back and reread what I wrote. And that's when he wrote an email that I never expected, which was to actually acknowledge that I had my own point of view and my own feelings and all that stuff. And, I actually haven't fully processed what all of that means. It actually had very little immediate impact on me emotionally. And I think that's because I'd already resolved that this email that I sent, it didn't really matter what the outcome was going to be. It was more for me, it was more for my ability to clearly communicate my point of view and my voice. And so, really, what he responded with was of little consequence to me, even with as surprised as I was with how he did respond. But let me tell you something interesting that happened after that. And so I was laying in bed next to my wife, and all of a sudden I just started listening to my own body and all that stuff. And as I've touched on before, I've always suffered from anxiety for as long as I can remember. I mean, it got diagnosed in me like in my early 20s, but that's just when I finally got a name for whatever it was that I was feeling. But typically throughout my life, I've been living on a scale from 1 to 10 in anxiety terms, somewhere in the 5 to 7 range. It's just like it's always there. And with going through all the help and therapy and all that stuff and dealing with all the trauma and all the past, that number has started to come down on a regular basis. And but it's always there. It may be less, but it's always present. I'm always aware of it. And so I'm laying in bed next to my wife, and I turned to her and I was like, "Huh, this is interesting." She's like, "What?" I was like, "I think my anxiety is at like a 1. Like it's practically not there. I can just barely sense that it's there, but it is gone." And I've never felt so at peace in terms of anxiety. And this had to have been a result of, finally finding my own voice and confronting one of the biggest things that I needed to confront, which is my dad. So I want to dig into this just a little bit because this is where let me just explain that I am someone who is a very like I gravitate towards happiness and fun and all of that stuff. This is something that my mom had always described about me, that if there was fun, like I would gravitate towards it. I have an aversion to pain, which I never really thought of in those terms until recently. But what would happen in my life is that if anything painful happened, it doesn't mean that I didn't feel it. I mean, I would always feel the pain on a deep level, but I hated that feeling so much that I would figure out whatever I needed to do to bury that feeling as quickly as possible so I could get back to feeling happy again. And this coping mechanism is what I'm calling it now, was really effective at first. I could just get rid of that pain, ignore it, and go back to being happy. Well, the problem is if you think of it as sort of like a bucket, and at first, it's empty and you're filling it up with some of this stuff, and you don't know that you're filling it up. But over time, what happens is that as that bucket fills up, and it rises towards the top, what it does is squeeze out the remaining capacity you have for happiness and joy. So whereas I was like always happy all the time, I would start to cycle. And as that bucket would fill up, my time in between being happy and then being dragged back by anxiety or stress or unhappiness or whatever, that cycle would just shorten and shorten and shorten, because I would go and I'd take that pain and I would throw it back down and I'd ignore it until finally this bucket is overflowing. And let me tell you what would happen when this would overflow. So basically I could kind of keep things where that bucket was not quite overflowing. And so that was where my anxiety was like, a 5 to 7 most of the time. But then there was a point in about 2 or 3 years ago where the bucket started to spill over. And now all of a sudden it went from just feeling anxiety to straight on panic attacks. That's when the bucket was overflowing. So by not dealing with any of this stuff, it just progressively got worse. I was miserable. I was unhappy. I was making my wife miserable. She didn't even recognize the person that I was at that time, because the stuff that was coming out of me at that point just wasn't me anymore. But I was so full of anxiety and so full of whatever that was, that I just kind of became a bit of a lunatic. And so this is where I really started getting help with a therapist and stuff, because that was so painful, and I didn't know how to control my emotions. I didn't know how to control all the anxiety. That's when I went and I got help. But here's the thing, guys, is that as I started working with the therapist, it was like, well, let's start seeing what's in there. Let's see what is triggering all of these panic attacks and stuff. And so, you'd kind of reach into that bucket and you'd pull one thing out and be like, huh, there might be something to that. And so you talk about it and you deal with it, maybe even confront it. And now it's free. Well, it would temporarily lower my anxiety and I would feel a little bit better. But then ultimately I would kind of come right back to that same point again. So, next session, dig back in there, pull out the next thing out of the bucket, look at it, deal with it. And it's like, great, okay, now I feel better again. But then, I keep cycling where I just kind of end up back at the same place. So what does all this mean? What this means is that, it was good to deal with all this stuff, but it's twofold. One, you have to dig this stuff back out. You have to deal with it. You have to figure out what to do with it. You have to feel that pain again. But if you aren't simultaneously figuring out in your day-to-day life how to confront the new pain that is happening, your bucket will, while you're pulling one thing out, one thing goes right back in again. And that's absolutely what was happening with me. Now, I'm still working at that part of like trying to prevent things from going back in. And it's getting better because I'm finding my voice. I'm finding my clarity and what I want and what I'm trying to do. And recognize when I'm actually doing that. I think that's the hardest part. But with the stuff with my dad, that was the biggest piece that was like taking up the biggest portion of that bucket. And once I took that out, I examined it, and I mean, it was weeks, months since I haven't even really talked to my dad since last August. That's when I created space and started really working on this stuff. When I pulled that big rock out of that bucket inside and started dealing with that, that was a process. But now that I have dealt with it, and I don't want to say that in the past tense because I think I'm still dealing with it on a certain level, but I've gotten over the hump with this stuff. Well, guess what? I just emptied the majority of my bucket. And because it is mostly empty now, and I'm doing better at trying to keep it as empty as possible, my anxiety has dropped considerably. Now, I still do feel anxiety. It's just that my baseline is a lot lower than it was. It gives me a lot more threshold for stressful situations to be able to still think clearly. Because as that bucket fills, when you reach a stressful or you get into a stressful situation, which life is always going to throw at you, all of a sudden, like I'm starting at a 5 and then shooting up to like an 8. Well, you can't think clearly at an 8. But if you're starting at a 1 or 2 and you shoot up to like a 4 or 5, yeah, it's stressful, but you can still think. Like you're not losing your mind in those situations. So that's been the real benefit of sending that email to my dad. So let me recap a little bit, because what I am not saying is that if you're struggling with your parents, that you should just type up an email and confess all these things and then everything is going to be okay. You got to do the work first. You have to make sure that what it is that you're saying and that what you're communicating is truly your own voice. Because if it isn't your voice, it will come across as disingenuous. It won't be authentic, and you'll probably do more damage than good. And then you'll end up spending more time trying to, figure out why you said what you said and undoing all that damage. So anyway, so to recap all of this, I just wanted to share that I felt like this was a really big win, that being able to send that email has significantly reduced my anxiety. So a question for you guys, what is your bucket filled with? Do you feel like that bucket inside is continually filling up? Are you refusing to deal with that pain that is coming your way? Because life throws all of it at you, and you can't ignore it all the time. You got to deal with it, or else you will lose the capacity to continue to deal with this stuff, and you're going to squeeze the joy out of your life. So, anyway, please share in the comments. Let's chat. Let me know. Let me know how you guys are doing. Thanks for listening.